This week on The Other Side, Tucker Carlson schools an Australian journalist in one of the finest takedowns in recent Aussie media history. A lefty senior Liberal Party figure comes out from behind his mask and backs the Labor Party on a no nuclear power future. Julian Assange walks free, but is he a hero or a villain? We'll try to work that out. And how do we make sense of the nuclear power debate when people are throwing crazy numbers around? I'll be joined in this week's show by The Other Side's energy guru, Ben Beattie from the Baseload podcast, and our economics guru, SCOTT PELTO, to try to make sense of it all. G'day Brisbane, g'day Canberra, g'day Australia. This is episode 319 of The Other Side for the weekend commencing Friday the 28th of June 2024. I'm Damien Curry and this is our last show for season 1 of 2024. We'll be taking a much needed winter break for 2 weeks, returning on July 19. But we will be putting out segment clips every single night while we're away on YouTube, featuring some of our best content from season 1. The Other Side is a weekend show. It brings you a summary of the best bits of news and commentary of the week that was, without the woke, with new episodes up every Friday night. America's most successful and highly rated news show presenter, perhaps of all time, Tucker Carlson, has taken a piece of my heart and torn into the Australian mainstream media and especially the ABC for their twisted priorities in terms of the stories that they cover. Tucker has been in Australia this past week doing a series of shows with Clive Palmer's Australian Freedom Conference. He took some questions from the media in Canberra on Wednesday night and he learned what a joke Australian journalism has become firsthand. First, this question from the delightful 9 media newspapers, The Age and Sydney Morning Herald.
The media can be extremely negative, so it's nice to hear uplifting comments about our country.
It's an amazing country.
It is, and I think we forget that in Australia oftentimes, so I appreciate that. You've preempted my question on Putin. Putin! I think you did strategically because you knew it's what we'd ask.
Putin! He's so bad!
Mainstream right-wingers like Boris Johnson, Australian Liberals, some of their MPs are in the crowd, are vehemently anti-Putin. They believe he's a reprehensible figure who doesn't believe in the values of conservatism, such as the rule of law and democracy, which gives us the freedoms we have in our country. I'm interested, do you feel any level of shame or regret that you were termed a useful idiot, and then post your interview, Vladimir Putin himself said in his Russian media that he was surprised at how weak your questions were, and he also said that you were wrong when you said that no other journalist had asked to interview him. He said, that's not true. We only thought Tucker was the only person to report fairly.
Wait, I thought that you were describing Putin as a psychopathic liar, and yet now you're taking his word for things?
Now, I can't begin to unpack how passive-aggressive that question was from the Sydney Morning Herald's and Melbourne Age's Paul Sakal, how unjournalistic it was, how editorial it was, and laced with self-assured self-righteousness. It was typical of the Sydney and Melbourne journo set. A 2-minute lecture, not a question. And I edited it down. The question was basically, you're an idiot. Are you ashamed of your interview with Putin? And Tucker was smart enough to call it out right up front.
Let me just quickly unpack your absurd soliloquy if I can. First, I'm stuck on the idea that Boris Johnson is a right-winger. Do you know Boris Johnson? I do. Boris Johnson is a criminal buffoon who, like so many who claim to love Ukraine, is single-handedly responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian men in this war that Ukraine cannot win. And I would refer you to Wikipedia. How many more people does Russia have than Ukraine? Do you know? 100 million. 100 million. And in a land war, that's a relevant number. It is not possible for Ukraine to beat Russia. The best they can do is sue for peace. That's been known, including by Zelensky, who wanted that since the early days of this conflict. And Boris Johnson, on orders from the Biden administration, shut down, and this is not a disputed fact, this is a fact, admitted by everybody now, shut down the peace negotiations almost 2 years ago. And Ukraine has been completely destroyed. And now Zelensky has passed a law allowing foreign corporations to own land there. So you tell me what Ukraine is going to look like in 30 years.
Tucker Carlson speaks his mind. He's razor sharp and he's one of the best broadcasters and communicators the planet has ever seen. He got fired from Fox News for doing what journalists are supposed to do, asking probing, more difficult questions and actually challenging the rulers, the elites and those in power. He would criticise both the left and the right. He never asks anyone to agree with what he says. I certainly don't agree with him some of the time, and he believes his role in interviews is to shut up and let the other person speak and let the audience think for themselves, something most Australian journalists wouldn't be caught dead doing. Tucker became immensely successful. To understand just how successful, take a look at this. These are the ratings for America's three biggest 24-hour cable news channels. Fox consistently outrates the ratings of left-wing lunatics at MSNBC and the left-wing bores at CNN combined. 2 million viewers in prime time. But what you can't see here is what Tucker used to rate. He used to consistently get 4 to 6 million views for his show. And he was fired at his peak. It's hard to understand how any shareholder of News Corp could be happy with the decision to remove him. But they did, because he wouldn't toe the line.
What's happened in Ukraine, orchestrated by the Western powers, including your government, and I hope you do, and driven by my government, I feel shame about it, I hope you do too, is really one of the great crimes of my lifetime. So the idea that somehow if you're against that, you're for Putin, well, of course, that's absurd. And by the way, speaking of your friend Boris Johnson, he attacked me, of course, ad hominem, and so I called him. He was a journalist, not surprisingly, a man of low character, not shocking. And so I called him and I said, well, you've called me all these names. Why don't you sit down for a conversation? I happen to be in your rainy, depressing slum, London, and we could have a conversation. And he said, I won't do that unless you pay me $1 million. That's a fact. That's a non-disputed fact. I have the text messages. Well, just today, Julian Assange was released after 12 years in custody, and your government did nothing. The UK made it possible, and the United States demanded it. You tell me how that's consistent with the rule of law or democracy. It's not. It's ruled by the intel agencies. It's lawlessness, and it's a crime. So I'm not saying that we're morally equivalent to Putin. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is our concern should be first and foremost, how are our countries run? And we give our own leaders a pass time and time again because they point to some other creep on the world stage and say, he's bad. Kim Jong-un is bad. Well, yeah, of course he's bad. That's why I don't live in North Korea. That's why I don't live in Russia. I have no interest in living in Russia. But the point is, you're bad too. And the fact that he's bad does not allow you to continue being bad.
I used to be an Australian journalist. I had my issues with the news and the way we reported it back in the 80s and 90s when I was working at 3AW and Channel 10 and the ABC and Triple M and 4BC. But when I came back to Australia in 2020, after 18 years abroad, not only could I not stand to work in TV news, I couldn't stand to watch it. So I started this show. The problem with journalism in Australia today starts with academia. Our universities have journalism schools, and instead of teaching stuff that journalists should have to know, like economics, statistical analysis, basic math, how business works, how politics actually works, the so-called academics, because they themselves aren't intelligent enough to understand any of that stuff, teach journalism students social science rubbish. And I put science in quotation marks there. That is nothing but left-wing indoctrination. They teach activism journalism. And brilliantly, the left have managed to infiltrate our newsrooms with Labor and Greens voters with no idea of how the world actually works, pretending to be journalists. And that is the commercial media. At the ABC, it's like they never even left uni.
I really resent what I have seen across the West in the past 15 years, and it's a sea change from my youth when my father was a reporter. This alignment between media organizations and the government, I find disgusting, actually. I think it's a perfect inversion of what you're supposed to do. If you're a journalist, your job is to challenge power on behalf of the powerless. It is not to align with the powerful against the powerless. And that is precisely what you have done. I watched your ABC this morning in my hotel room for about 20 minutes until I looked around for a vomit bag. And I watched, it was one of the most grotesque, I couldn't even believe it was real.
Oh, it's real, all right. And we're all forced to pay for it. If we refuse, we go to jail. Tucker said the second story on the ABC News was about 4 Australians being found dead in a house because of a drug overdose on a new synthetic opioid. Then the next story was about the move by the government to require prescriptions to buy nicotine.
And we were treated to a 15-minute lecture on ABC, whatever the hell that is, about how nicotine is dangerous and we need to keep it out of the hands of Australians. And I'm like, wait a second. Nicotine, first of all, is not dangerous. That's not true. That's factually incorrect. You know nothing about the science, A. B, compared to what? Compared to what? Oh, we have this new synthetic opioid that's killing people. The government, not too concerned. What they're really concerned about is that people might be using nicotine, which, by the way, has the byproduct of raising testosterone levels and making people a little harder to command. That's a massive threat. So this is the point where the media gets involved and says, wait a second, let's chart the death toll from vaping versus fentanyl. Maybe one's a little worse than the other. And what exactly are you doing about it? Why don't you press your ministers and your prime minister? Like, what are you doing about it, about drug use? And the answer is nothing.
Tucker says the failure of the media to properly report on the injuries and deaths from vaccines used during the COVID crisis is astounding.
And the COVID vax, the mRNA vax from Pfizer, has caused more injuries than all self-reported injuries than all the previous vaccination campaigns for the last 50 years combined. And no one in the media has written a story about it. Because, well, there are a couple reasons. One is that Pfizer is one of the largest advertisers on television in the United States. And the point is not to sell the product. And I worked in television my whole life. So this is not speculation. The point is not to sell some weird drug for rheumatoid arthritis to TV viewers because people can't prescribe their own drugs. No, that's not the point. This is not a retail sales pitch. This is an insurance policy that the drug makers are buying with the big media companies. We're your biggest advertiser. Maybe if we have a lot of vax injuries from a brand new product, you won't say too much, and they don't. I think that's completely corrupt and shameful.
On that note, I might pass you over to Andrew Green from the ABC.
Oh, I love it. You going to take my nicotine? It's dangerous.
Good afternoon, Tucker.
A prescription for nicotine. Okay.
I missed that segment this morning.
It's shocking. You should watch it. It's the dumbest thing I've ever seen on television.
I do want to ask about a country you haven't mentioned today, and that's China.
I just love the way Tucker pops the nicotine gum into his mouth as he takes down the ABC guy. It is gold. Nicotine is pretty harmless, by the way. Addictive, but harmless. It's the smoke in cigarettes that's dangerous. Anyway, back to China, and probably the most important answer for Australia's dumb, distracted media.
Do you think China poses a threat here?
I think that, first of all, I think it's very complicated, but I think the overview is this. China has 1.4 billion people and not enough resources or land. Australia has 26 million people and a sparsely populated continent that is brimming, overflowing with resources that countries with expanding economies need. And I don't know how expensive your politicians are. I'm guessing not very. So I don't think it'd be too much of a lift for China to just buy them all. And I assume they already are doing that. I mean, obviously they are doing that. And they're doing that in my country too. They bought the current president's son. So I'm not mad at China for that. Well, they did. They bought Hunter Biden. I mean, that's the whole story. And it's proven. Okay. So I'm not mad at China about that, just for the record. I'm not particularly anti-China. I don't want to live in China. It's not my system at all. And I find a lot of parts of the culture repugnant. On the other hand, I see China, a country acting in its own interest. So I'm not mad about that. I'm mad about the countries like my own and possibly yours that allow themselves to be taken advantage of. That's the truly shameful thing.
An uplifting analysis there, but unfortunately true. Now, we've saved the best for last. There is nothing so brainwashed as the young, self-righteous, obnoxious brat Australian journalist, all full of opinions and hubris, unjustified by their age and inexperience, and with zero respect, of course, for any far more experienced person, particularly if they're a man over 50. This is the delightful Kat Wong from AAP.
Hi, Tucker. Thank you so much for your address today. So you talked a little bit about immigration, and in the past you've talked about how white Australians, Americans, Europeans are being replaced by non-white immigrants in what is often referred to as the Great Replacement Theory. This is the same...
Have I said that whites are being replaced?
Well,
I don't think I said that.
Well, it's been mentioned on your show 4,000 times, and
Really, when did I say that?
on your
I said
show,
whites are being replaced?
you have said that before.
Really?
Yeah.
I would challenge you to cite that because I'm pretty sure I haven't said that. I said
I mean-
native-born Americans are being replaced, including blacks.
Native-born Americans.
Native-born Americans.
And-
Americans who, like black Americans, African Americans have been in the United States for, in many cases, their families over 400 years. And their concerns are every bit as real and valid and alive to me as the concerns of white people whose families have been there 400 years. So I've never said that whites are being replaced. Not one time. And you can't cite it.
Untrue.
So
Oh my God, I'm Kat Wong. Nobody ever challenges me. I'm an Asian Australian female under 40. You don't get to challenge me. I'm a protected species. I'm allowed to make stuff up and tell lies. I'm immune from fault.
we just met, but when our relationship starts with a lie, it makes it tough to be friends. So
I mean, you've been lying
let's
about
pull
my
that back. I'm
fellow
happy to
colleagues
explain what I
as
do
well,
think.
so-
You actually can't say it because I didn't say it, and I don't believe it. And I'm telling you that to your face, so why don't you just accept me at face value? My
because it's
concern
not
is that
true.
the people who are born in the country are the main responsibility of its leaders. And as noted earlier, when those leaders shift their concern from the people whose responsibility it is to take care of to people around the world to put their priorities above that of their own citizens, that's immoral. And they are being replaced in my country, people who were born in the United States. And the birth rate tells the whole story. They're not at replacement rate. And so the U.S. population is growing because we're importing people from other countries. And my view is that happy people have children, and a functioning economy allows them to do that. And we don't have that. And so you need to fix the economy and fix the culture and make it so that people who want to have kids can. You don't just go for the quick sugar fix of importing new people. Like, that's my position. And if you think that's racist, that's your problem.
I never called you a racist.
But of course you are suggesting, and
No,
I
you're
must say one of the
suggesting that
reasons
white
people don't
people-
like people like you in the media is that you never say exactly what you mean. Your slurs are all by implication, and you're about to tell me the great replacement theory is racist or anti-Semitic, whatever. I've said what I've said to you right now like 100 times in public. I hope to, if I live long enough, say it 100 more times. I think it's completely honest and real, not racist or scary. It's factually true. It's not a theory, it's a fact. And the whole point of your question was to be like, you're a scary racist.
Well, I haven't
And my
actually finished my
response is, no,
question.
I'm not. Okay, well, how about no more lying in your questions, and then I'll answer it.
I didn't call you racist. No, but you were just implying it like out of control. I mean, these kids are out of control, Australia. This is not okay. He called her out on her calling him a racist. She claims she didn't, but I'm sorry. That was clearly the intent of her line of questioning. But does she show any remorse or professionalism and then back off a bit? Oh no. Just like any kid who's never been mentored properly because everyone is too afraid to mentor young women these days, she doubles down in her absolute arrogance.
This is the same theory, or as you say, idea, that has inspired the New York Buffalo shooting where 11 black Americans
come
were killed.
on.
2
You know what
white
I mean?
Americans were killed.
Like,
And it's also
okay,
inspired...
it's not, first of all,
It's inspired the worst, one of the worst Australian guns
how do
of
they
all
get
time
people
to
this
shoot
stupid in the media? I guess it doesn't pay well. Look, I'm sorry. I've lived among people like you for too long, and I don't mean to call you stupid. Maybe you're just pretending to be, but I'm totally against violence. I'm totally against the war in Ukraine, for example, which doubtless you support. And like all dutiful liberals, support more carnage. I don't. I hate mass shootings, actually. Nothing I said, what does it mean to inspire something? My views are not bigoted against any group. They're honest. They're factual. That's not hate. That's reality. And my views derive from my deep concern for Americans, actually. Americans aren't having kids because they can't afford to. And nobody in charge cares. And so that's my position. That doesn't inspire mass shootings. How dare you try to tie me to some lunatic who murdered people? How dare you, actually?
Yeah, how dare you? You call him a racist in the clear underlying premise of your first question. Then you gaslight him and claim that you didn't. Then instead of having the maturity and good character to check yourself and back off a bit, you obnoxiously double down and absurdly imply that he's responsible for mass shootings. That is not journalism. That is not okay. And AAP should do something about it. That is grossly immoral and unethical behaviour for anyone, let alone someone who claims to be a journalist. And then you keep going.
Right, so therefore you support gun control?
What? I thought it
You
couldn't
don't
get
want any
dumber,
more
but
shootings?
it did.
Yeah, I thought it couldn't get any dumber, but it did. I apologise, Tucker. That, folks, is the level, that's the state of my former profession, which is really a trade, journalism. That's the state of Australian journalism right now. Shame on her and every jerk who's ever enabled her by employing her and those like her in Australian newsrooms to progress their careers unsupervised and unchallenged because they're protected by our insane workplace cultural guidelines that prevent grown-ups scolding out of control children when they should be. We have totally lost the plot in the workplace, Australia. Young people need to respect their elders again. Especially, by the way, the male ones for a change, and listen and learn and be told when you are playing wrong and out of line. We have a cultural crisis, and that was the perfect example of the danger of it. You can catch us here on The Other Side every Friday night from 8 p.m. on YouTube. If you'd like to support us, the best way is to subscribe to our channel right here on YouTube. It's absolutely free. Just hit the subscribe button and the little bell too, because the bell will notify you when we post our content. And also, if you're feeling generous, feel free to send us a super thanks donation. We don't get paid quite as much as the journalists at AAP. You can do that by clicking the little $ thanks icon under the video frame on YouTube. You can also follow us on X, Twitter, at The Other Side Oz. Sorry, just at Other Side Oz, AUS. It all helps. We're taking a little winter holiday break for the first 2 weeks of July, so our next show will be on Friday, July 19. No show next week or the week after, but we will be dropping some holiday clips every single night at 7:30 as we do every night on YouTube and X, so you won't miss us, and we will be back before you know it. So, Julian Assange is finally free. He struck a plea deal with the United States and pled guilty to a charge of conspiring to obtain and disclose national defence information after publishing national security documents relating to the Iraq and Afghanistan wars via WikiLeaks in 2010. For that, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison and then released immediately because of time already served in the UK. Now, many see Assange as a hero of journalism and the free press. We've probably all seen the shocking video leaked to WikiLeaks by Bradley Manning, who now likes to be called Chelsea Manning. It was horrific stuff showing the battlefield killing of civilians by US forces from an Apache helicopter. 2 journalists employed by the global news agency Reuters were killed. The US military apparently mistaking their camera equipment for weapons. I'm going to show you that video now. A warning, you will see dead bodies, but the point of actual killing we've edited out of this version.
Yeah. Hotel 26, Crazy Horse 18.
We'll call Freak Change, Mike Charlie, Mike Bravo.
There, 1 o'clock. Haven't seen anything since then.
Just I see your element. You got about 4 Humvees out along this.
You're clear. All right, firing.
Line here. What's the space line?
Let me know when you have it.
We'll shoot.
Light them all up.
202 traffic, 260.
Come on, fire. All I gotta do is pick up a weapon.
This is Bushmaster 7, go ahead.
Roger, we have a black SUV or a bongo truck.
Bushmaster 7, Roger. This is Bushmaster 7, Roger, engage.
1-8, gauge.
Clear. Come on.
311. 20.
Magnet radio aggressive 3-4 is off zone 208 for zone 1. Call for change.
Aggressive 4-3, zone. Correction, aggressive 3-4. Back at the 2 civilian kids to Rusty. They're going to have the IPs up. Link up with us over here, break. IPs will take them up to a local hospital, over.
Oh, it's their fault for bringing their kids to a battle.
That's right.
The brutal reality of war. But does the leak of that video and the leak of other documents proving the US government was lying about civilian casualty numbers in the wars, leaks that are up there with the Vietnam War Pentagon Papers in terms of necessary exposure of government wrongdoing, does that positive action by Julian Assange and WikiLeaks justify the many other leaks that Assange oversaw that were just irresponsible document dumps? The publishing of troves of sensitive intel documents that put people's lives at risk and compromised our soldiers and local intel sources in these wars. People vehemently disagree on whether he's a hero or a villain for those reasons. And the best debate of the week on this point, I think, was on the Piers Morgan Uncensored show.
Well, the two sides couldn't be clearer. There's an obvious tension between the journalistic duty to publish all truths and the responsibility of the people charged with keeping us safe. including the men and women who fight to do so. But saying the words national security doesn't give anybody, however powerful, the right to behave with impunity. There's a long tradition of holding those powerful people to account. The Pentagon Papers in the 70s exposed crimes in the Vietnam War and were feted for their impact and bravery. The sorry saga of Julian Assange may already be enough of a deterrent to prevent anyone doing it again. But is that a good thing?
Indeed, it is not. But neither is putting people's lives at risk by not doing proper journalism and checking what you're publishing before you publish it. Michael Schellenberger is an independent journalist best known for his work in exposing the Twitter files. He put the hero side of the argument.
Unfortunately, it's not a huge victory for the First Amendment. As you mentioned, in 1971, the U.S. Supreme Court made very clear that the publisher of leaked documents are protected in our First Amendment rights to publish those documents. The person that leaks them is not. Obviously, they're constrained by U.S. laws, and understandably, the person that leaked the documents to Julian Assange was prosecuted and served a sentence. But I think this is a very chilling case on the rights of journalists, and we've seen that Pentagon Papers principle be challenged, be under attack in recent years, including around the election of Joe Biden in 2020. So my concern is that this still sends a potentially chilling effect, given how severe the punishment was of Julian Assange, but obviously a really wonderful day for him and his family.
Michael Schellenberger speaking to Piers Morgan Uncensored there. Ben Ferguson is a talk show host and a podcaster with a very big following in the US. He put the villain side of the argument.
And there's a difference between the Pentagon Papers and what Assange has done. And I'll give you a perfect example of that. He knew that he was putting lives at risk when he decided to release the Afghan diary, which was those, including some even in the Taliban, that were working with the UK and the United States of America. And he knew when he put those names out there that they were going to be hunted down by the Taliban and they were going to be brutally murdered. And many of them were. Many of their families were tortured. Many of their children were tortured. Many of them were beheaded. So when you try to convince me that he is a journalist, no, he's not. He didn't act responsibly. Could you make the argument that there were some things within what he put out there on the internet that maybe could have been in the category of the Pentagon Papers? Absolutely. But when you start going out there and publishing the names of individuals and sources that are giving information about a terrorist organization to the U.S. and other countries, you cross a line there that has nothing to do with journalism. And those people, many of them were viciously murdered, including children. And so I don't feel sorry for him. I think he should still be in jail. I'm not celebrating this day. It puts national security at risk all over the world, because now the question you have to ask is, if you are an informant, if you're trying to help stop World War III, if you're no information within Al-Qaeda or ISIS-K, and you work with people around the world, are you going to be outed? And if you're outed, are they going to hunt you down, your children down, and murder them in front of you? That is what he was a part of, and you can't rewrite that aspect of history.
But Assange's lawyer and WikiLeaks said this week that nobody died as a result of the publishing of the information. And the US authorities admitted that in the negotiations and hearings this past week too, a point Michael Schellenberger was quick to bring up.
This has been repeated a few times. It is not the case that anybody has found that anybody died due to the release of Julian Assange, of the documents by Julian Assange. In fact, quite the opposite. They found that it had not. Even Joe Biden. Let me finish. Allow me to finish.
Okay, let Michael finish, and I'll come back to you.
Even President Biden had admitted that it had not resulted in any deaths or any sacrificing of national security. Now, on the issue of asking for documents, I think it is important for investigative journalists to know that they can't solicit information from their whistleblowers. You have to be very disciplined about this. Anybody who's a working journalist and has spoken to their lawyer about this knows they need to be careful. And we also need to be careful not to redact the information before we release it. I agree there was some carelessness there. However, the punishment was far more severe than any misdeeds here. Again, nobody was harmed. No national security was undermined by this. It is true, and it was found by repeated investigations.
I love how a moment ago everybody's like, oh, you can't trust the government, but now you're quoting the government saying no one died and no one was harmed because of this. That is total crap. I will quote now for you the Taliban spokesman who said, we're studying the report when the report came out. He then said, after the files were released to the public in the summer of 2010, quote, we knew about the spies and we are working to find them. We will be investigating through our own secret service whether the people mentioned our spies are working with the U.S., and if they are U.S. spies, quote, then we know how to punish them. Fast forward. They then put executions online and then said that they had actually killed people on their websites, on Twitter back then before it was X, saying that they had hunted down the people working with the spies.
You're repeating Taliban propaganda. You're literally repeating Taliban propaganda at this moment. You're spreading Taliban disinformation.
Let me ask you this seriously, because I'm not dumb enough to buy what you're saying right now. Do you actually believe the Taliban wouldn't go out and kill people that were working with the United States of America? Are you that dumb as a journalist to believe the Taliban doesn't kill and behead people that betray them? Like, give me a break.
Why are you spreading Taliban misinformation? You're participating in the Taliban's propaganda information. Nothing you said proves what you claim it proves. In fact, the U.S. government has itself admitted that it did not result in the deaths of any American soldiers or undermine American national security.
Defending Assange and journalists. It's not journalistic integrity, by the way, to go out there and to put everything on the internet when someone sends it to you, which is what he did. An actual journalist who has integrity.
I agree that he should have redacted some of that information. That's a separate issue.
Out there. But you say, oh, you're a journalist, you can do no wrong.
Hang on.
I don't trust the Taliban, I trust Joe Biden.
Ben?
Okay, so some serious disagreement there over whether people actually did get killed by what Assange did. My position is this. Does it matter if they did or didn't? Isn't the real issue that they could have been? It disturbs me greatly that we're mixing up two different things here. The very right and good and correct work that Assange did in publishing some of the Manning material, and the very bad thing that he did in just data dumping classified intelligence. Look, I'm as suspicious as anyone of the power of intelligence agencies. I think that they are a bit out of control at the moment, and like most bureaucrats, are not being accountable to the elected officials and the people that they're supposed to serve. It might be a good thing to completely reorganise and reset organisations like the CIA, MI5 and ASIO, and the NSA and MI6 and ASIS every decade or so, because they can become powerful and dangerous laws unto themselves. But it's also true that we need intelligence organisations as part of our defence against foreign hostile actors. So while what Assange did in releasing the Manning material related to where the government had overstepped the mark and committed war crimes and underrepresented civilian casualties in a war is good, it's bad to just dump documents out there without checking them first. That's not journalism, and it doesn't deserve the protection of the US First Amendment. In fact, it puts the First Amendment at risk from those who would attack it by giving them some ammunition to do so. By the way, Australia desperately needs a similar protection of free speech in its constitution, although it should just be a given natural right, of course. It does seem that we need to be enshrining it in law to prevent people like our E-Safety Commission acting like political censors. But anyway, back to Julian Assange and the mega data dump. That is not journalism. That is the action of a child activist that would make Extinction Rebellion and the clowns at Just Stop Oil proud. That said, Assange has been punished enough for whatever misdeeds he may have done. And what sickens me more than anything, I just want to point this out, is that for years Assange was kept in a tiny cell, locked up 23 hours a day. Now, I'm a fairly conservative type and a big fan of Great Britain, as you know, if you watch this show regularly, but that is psychological torture by Britain of an Australian citizen. I repeat, that was psychological torture by Britain of an Australian citizen. And we let it happen with little fuss, and it was completely unnecessary. He should have been kept in low security facilities while all this was being sorted out. He suffered gross punishment by process and politics. Being locked up in the maximum security Belmarsh prison has absolutely nothing to do with due legal process, and certainly nothing to do with justice. So you can argue what you like about Assange's wrongdoing. Nothing excuses that nonsense from the British authorities. And it's a national disgrace that falls firmly at the feet of our two biggest allies, the UK and the US. For a long time on this show, we've said that the left have infiltrated Australia's main supposed to be centre-right and conservative political party, the Liberal Party, and we got proof of it in big, bright, shiny lights this week when a left-wing Liberal member was appointed to a plum Labor government job in a political move designed simply to embarrass Peter Dutton and yet again put the best interests of our country second by political game playing.
Today, Cabinet has agreed to appoint the Honourable Matt Keane as Chair of the Climate Change Authority.
On this show, we don't assume everyone lives in New South Wales, so we need to tell you who this bloke is. Matthew Keane is a 43-year-old state politician who was the Treasurer in New South Wales from 2021 until 2023 when the Liberals lost power. Before that, he was the state's Energy and Environment Minister, so he's got some cred for the new job that Albo's given him as head of the Climate Change Authority. What is that, you ask? And why is Albo appointing a Liberal to this job? Well, the Climate Change Authority is another of these statutory authorities, these little offices that the government likes to set up to waste our tax money to do the things that the bureaucracy should already be doing but is failing to do so. So instead of fixing the bureaucracy and running the government properly, they set up another bureaucracy to make it look like they're doing something, and so they don't have to sack anyone or hold anyone actually accountable for anything. For those of us who actually work and are productive in this country, that would be like you noticing that your small business staff weren't getting the job done, but instead of sacking them and fixing things, you just hire some new people to do their job instead. But I'd go broke if I did that, I hear you say. Well, yes, but that's where government is different. Government just tell their customers, us, to pay more. But I couldn't ask my customers to pay more, I hear you say. They'd just go somewhere else. Yes, but government can force their customers to pay more with guns, until they give up and leave the country, if they can. Anyway, I digress. We have a climate change authority, whether we like it or not, and it costs about, well, nobody knows because it isn't in their annual report. I checked. But it's in the order of tens of millions of dollars a year. As Senator Matt Canavan said this week, it's just another Canberra waste of money and needs to be shut down. And now, in one of the most blatantly obvious, transparent acts of political theatre we've seen in years, a move so obvious that a child would notice it, Albo appoints the lefty Liberal Matt Keane to be the head of the thing, and the first thing that comes out of Keane's mouth is, surprise, an attack on Peter Dutton's nuclear policy that he announced last week. Like a good puppy? Who's a good little boy then, eh? You're a good Matty, you are.
In 2019, when I was appointed as the Energy Minister by Gladys Berejiklian, I was told the first day on the job that in the next decade, 4 of the state's coal-fired power stations would come to an end. And we needed a mechanism in place to replace that capacity. Now, we looked at all options, including nuclear. Now, I didn't want to bankrupt the state, and I didn't want to put those huge costs onto families. That's why we introduced the Electricity Infrastructure Roadmap, which planned the transition to renewables backed up by firming and storage. This is not about ideology, this is about outcomes.
Well, maybe he is sincere. At least now he's working for the right political party for him, and being honest with the Australian public about his true politics. But as sincere as he may be, he's wrong. There's no reason nuclear should not be part of the energy mix for Australia moving forward, and no reason why we should be subsidising with taxpayers' money the renewables industry to the level that we are. We'll be discussing all that later in this week's show with our energy guru on the other side, Ben Beattie from the Baseload podcast, and our resident economics boffin, Mr. Scott Pelto. They'll both be here on set for me for a deep dive on all that very shortly. But you may be wondering what happened to the existing person in charge of the Climate Change Authority. Well, his name is Grant King, and he wasn't due to finish up his job until next year. Surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, the Australian newspaper reports that he recently backed calls for Australia to consider nuclear power as part of its future energy mix, and he supported plans to store carbon emissions from fossil fuel production. Uh-oh, that's not allowed. No solutions allowed other than renewables. That's the rules that the elites have bestowed upon us, and we must follow. So what happened to Mr. Grant King? Well, the Australian reports that he was subjected to an integrity and conflict of interest inquiry. Interesting timing. And even though Mr. King was not found to have any conflict of interest himself, Mr. Bowen thought it was a good idea to end his contract a year early. You see, you must never go off script. Mr. King recently very sensibly said that, quote, there's still a great desire to define good fuels and bad fuels, and that's not going to help us get there. We need absolutely everything working for us, and that also includes nuclear power. And that drew criticism from a far left-wing think tank called the Australia Institute and from Greens senators. Then the Australia Institute asked Mr. Bowen to investigate potential conflicts of interest at the Climate Change Authority. And they did, but they didn't find any, so now maybe it's time someone investigated the Australia Institute and the Greens for possible conflicts of interest, perhaps. Hey, just a reminder that The Other Side is available to watch every Friday night from 8 p.m. on YouTube. If you'd like to support us, the best way is to subscribe to our channel on YouTube. It's free. Just hit the subscribe button and the little bell too. That'll notify you when we post anything. Also, if you're feeling generous, feel free to send us a super thanks donation. You can do that by clicking the little $ thanks button icon under the video frame on YouTube. And you can also follow us on X, Twitter, @OtherSideOz. That's AUS. It all helps. We're taking a little winter holiday break for the first 2 weeks of July, so our next show will be on Friday, July 19. No show next week, but the week after, we will not have a show also, but we will be dropping some holiday clips every single night at 7:30 p.m. as we do every night on YouTube and X. But the week after that, we will be back. Something absolutely monumental happened this month, something that could affect you much more than you realise if you happen to own, or think you own, any property in this country. We didn't have time to mention it in last week's show, but we do need to talk about it because it is huge. As the National Indigenous Times newspaper reports, a landmark native title victory was had in the federal court. This is huge because it's the first time ever that, as the newspaper notes, the first time a heavily urbanised area on Australia's east coast has been given native title determination. So you could be wondering at this point, do you still own your own house? And more significantly, will you still own it in the future? I'd say technically speaking, no you don't if you live in this particular area, and probably not in the future if you live anywhere else in Australia. And the left-wing fact checkers would then accuse me of hysterically beating up the story and being a racist. But let's just look at the facts, shall we? Do a little pre-fact checking before the fact checkers fact check us. The Kabi people's native title rights over more than 300,000 hectares of land in southeast Queensland have been recognised. The recognition covers the cities of Gympie and Noosa, as well as much of the Sunshine Coast, including the Glasshouse Mountains, Maroochydore, Caloundra, Bribie Island and Majimba Island. 10,280 square kilometres, in fact. Now, this gives the Kabi people non-exclusive rights to the land, which if you own any of it, or thought you did, should concern you. What exactly does non-exclusive rights mean? Well, according to the National Indigenous Times, it does not give Aboriginal people total control of the land. Well, phew, that's a relief. Queensland South Native Title Services Chief Executive Tim Wishart told the newspaper that it's simply a recognition of the rights that the Kabi people can exercise in a non-exclusive way. Right, so what the heck does that mean? I mean, one of the reasons the whole Roman Empire fell was because people couldn't be sure of their property rights, so everyone stopped investing in stuff. Well, it's as clear as mud, and that is the problem. It is not clear, so people will not invest. What we've seen happen in other parts of Australia is native title holders with non-exclusive rights step in and stop people doing very basic stuff on their own property. The determination does grant rights to the Kabi people, including the right to take resources from the land. And this is the first determination in Queensland to grant that right. Previously, the right to take resources was limited to personal, communal and non-commercial purposes. Now, forgive me if this is still as clear as mud. I fear it may be intended to be that way, and I fear it may be the first step in a process of gradually extending those rights. So I hope we aren't beating up the story like a pack of racists, but I just want to make sure we're not pretending nothing is actually happening here either, like a pack of fools. So, Donald Trump and Joe Biden went head-to-head for the first time in a debate for the 2024 election cycle.
Former President Trump, I want to ask you about January 6, 2021. After you rallied your supporters that day, some of them stormed the Capitol to stop the constitutionally mandated counting of electoral votes. As president, you swore an oath to, quote, preserve, protect, and defend, unquote, the Constitution. What do you say to voters who believe that you violated that oath through your actions and inaction on January 6th and worry that you'll do it again?
Well, I don't think too many believe that. And let me tell you about January 6th. On January 6th, we had a great border. Nobody coming through, very few. On January 6th, we were energy independent. On January 6th, we had the lowest taxes ever. We had the lowest regulations ever. On January 6th, we were respected all over the world. All over the world, we were respected. And then he comes in, and we're now laughed at. We're like a bunch of stupid people. What happened to the United States' reputation under this man's leadership is horrible, including weaponization, which I'm sure at some point you'll be talking about, where he goes after his political opponent because he can't beat him fair and square.
You have 80 seconds left. My question was, what do you say to those voters who believe that you violated your constitutional oath through your actions and inaction on January 6, 2021, and worry that you'll do it again?
Well, I didn't say that to anybody. I said peacefully and patriotically.
The only person on this stage is a convicted felon is the man I'm looking at right now. And the fact of the matter is, what he's telling you is simply not true. The fact is that there was no effort on his part to stop what was going on up in Capitol Hill. And all those people, every one of those who were convicted, deserves to be convicted. The idea that they didn't kill somebody, just went in and broke down doors, broke the windows, occupied offices, turned over desks, turned them over statues. The idea that those people are patriots? Come on.
What was very, very unusual about this debate is that it was the first time that there's ever been a debate this early. You see, we haven't even had the big party conventions yet that formally appoint the candidates. The Republican Party convention is happening in Milwaukee from July 15 to 18, and the Democrats convention is happening in Chicago from August 19 to 22. Why is this significant? Well, because there's been a lot of talk that Joe Biden will not be the candidate because of his obvious ailing health. And there's speculation mounting that in the battle between the Clintons and the Obamas may be planning a move for a presidential comeback with Michelle Obama running. The thinking being that they need a celebrity of Donald Trump proportions to beat Donald Trump. And Barack, if not Michelle, might be that person. And having Michelle run as Barack's proxy will work just fine. Barack Obama himself did the best he could to hose that down this week during a Father's Day event in the US in which he appeared alongside the current president, and TV host Jimmy Kimmel, who was moderating it, asked this question.
President Obama, I have a Father's Day question for you.
Yes.
Who would make a better president, Sasha or Malia?
You know what? That is a question I do not need to answer because Michelle drilled into them so early that you would be crazy to go into politics. It will never happen.
Michelle Obama's office made an announcement 3 months ago that she will definitely not be running for president. Her mother passed away 2 weeks ago too. So I think an Obama candidacy is highly unlikely. But politics is a funny thing, and anything can happen if the right people want to make it happen. I certainly don't think Joe Biden should be the candidate for the Democrats, and the Democrats have zero talent to put up. Nobody would vote for Kamala Harris, and their next best thing is Gavin Newsom, but he's the governor of California, and his left-wing policies have wrecked the state, like really, really wrecked it, economically and socially. Amusingly, bookmakers all around the world have Michelle Obama at lower odds than many. It's certainly in Trump's interest that Biden makes it through the August Democratic Convention as the nominee. Now, this is why maybe we didn't see a knockout blow from Trump during this early first debate. He wants Joe in the game as long as possible. Hey, just a reminder that The Other Side is taking a little winter holiday break for the first 2 weeks of July, so our next show will be on Friday, July 19. No show next week or the week after, but we will be dropping some holiday clips every single night at 7:30 as we do every night on YouTube and X, so we'll still be around and back with fresh new content before you know it. Our main weekly show will then be available again to watch every Friday night from 8 p.m. on YouTube. We do need your help to keep going, so do feel free to send us a super thanks donation. You can do that by clicking the little $ thanks icon under the video frame on YouTube, and you can also follow us on X, Twitter at OthersideAUS, Otherside Oz. It all helps. If you're interested in sponsoring our show and getting some great exposure for your business, do reach out to us on Twitter, DM me at OthersideOz, or drop us an email at info@OthersideOz.com. Well, I'm confused, more confused than usual, about nuclear energy and the nuclear debate after listening to the politicians in this country talking for the past week. I thought we might get some smart people who actually know what they're talking about in to have a little chat about it on the other side. So I'd like to welcome our regular commentators. We have Ben Beattie, our energy guru and host of the Baseload podcast. Ben, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Damien.
And Scott Pelto, our economics guru. Scott, great to have you in the bench or on the bench again.
Thanks, Damien. Good to be here.
So, guys, it is really confusing for the mere mortal. So maybe if I start with you, Ben, knowing what you know about energy, being an electrical engineer, having worked in the industry as a consultant and understanding things, do you really see nuclear as part of the mix? Is it a viable part of the mix? There seems to be a lot of people who think it isn't.
It certainly should be part of the mix, and it is viable. It's viable in every other country that uses it. No one seems to have any problems with it anywhere else. There's no social license issues, there's no technical issues, and there's rarely any cost issues. So the cost issue seems to be the big problem that the government is raising, apart from the three-eyed fish memes and the glowing stick memes, which I think most of the population is getting a bit sick of now.
Well, I think when people resort to three-eyed fish as their argument, that they probably don't have much of an argument. So
yeah. So they resort back to not answering the question on what their own system's going to cost, and complaining about the cost of nuclear power. Now, it is factual to say there's been some cost blowouts in overseas projects. There's also factual to say that, like Paul Graham, the CSIRO, said a couple of weeks ago, that there's been cost blowouts in domestic projects, Snowy Hydro being a classic example.
Yes.
But unless we're building a nuclear power station underground in dodgy terrain, I fail to see how that applies, right? So
what is the rough cost? I mean, they talk about these new small modular nuclear reactors. What is their bang for buck in terms of capacity and what they cost? So what do you get for $1 billion, more or less?
Okay, so your small modular reactor is problematic to understand the cost at this point because we haven't really built any yet. I think we're looking at Canada to build the first ones, and I believe there's been some contracts signed recently. Most of the coalition's policy and most of the noise resulting hysteria around the announcement comes from the announcement of large nuclear reactors, which are the mature technology that we're seeing built everywhere else. So, for example, a Westinghouse AP1000, which has a nameplate output of about 1,150 megawatts.
So that's 1 gigawatt, more or less.
Basically, yeah. So
Okay.
that's a pretty big unit on the Australian scale.
What does that cost?
I think we're looking at 16 or 17 billion for something like that. So
Okay.
it's quite expensive.
So our total, just to put this into perspective, when we talk about gigawatt output and all that sort of thing, we're talking about the peak capacity, right? Or the capacity that this thing can deliver when it's running at full steam, right? And we need in Australia peak capacity of what, about 35 or?
So our grid demand varies between summer and winter and across the years, but 35 gigawatts is a pretty close number to what we're talking about. So on our hottest summer's day, which will be usually in early February, in the afternoon, sort of 4 or 5.
We've got a chart on that actually. Let's stick this one up, but the peak capacity chart, and you can see it's summer and winter. So it's summer in the orange, obviously, and winter in the blue there. And we're going from 1998 up to today. And you can see it really peaked around about 2007 summer. Would have been probably 2008 summer, I think, would have been the highest.
The important number,
35.
The biggest number is 35.
Yeah.
So 35 gigawatts. So if you had 35 gigawatts of generators installed, and they're all operating at 100% capacity perfectly, and they could meet that demand on that day. Obviously, you need a little bit of redundancy for maintenance, for unplanned outages, things like that. So we always have a little bit more than 35 gigawatts, but we're heading into some pretty uncharted territory where the Australian Energy Market Operator expects us to have something like 300 gigawatts, almost 10 times the capacity that we need. And this is mostly going to be wind and solar. And you need that much to meet the demand because it doesn't operate all the time.
Okay, right. So let's get into that in a moment. But so let's say we start using a lot of electricity for AI, which is going to be the next big thing, right?
Yep.
So if we start using a lot of electricity for AI and we double our need, electric vehicles are another thing, right? If more people start driving electric vehicles, we might need. So let's say it went up to, what would it go up to, 50 or 70 maybe in 20, 30 years?
Call it 200.
Oh, really? You think it could go up that much with?
This is a number that's been placed into some of the latest reports, 200 gigawatts of demand.
Wow. Okay. All right. Well, let's have a look at what we're doing right now in terms of capacity. We've got a chart there which we can put up. So this is quite an interesting chart because, wow, there's a heck of a lot of renewable stuff. The yellow is the solar, the green is the wind, but on the left is today and reality, or well, actually round about sort of the left side. So we're sitting around. The black is black coal, the brown is brown coal, the blue is gas. So.
Now, remember, this is all installed capacity. We don't use it all the time.
Yeah, right. So we've got about 50 now. So we're meeting our 35, okay. Which is basically, so this is basically why we don't have brownouts and blackouts. Okay, so if we get under 35, we're going to start seeing brownouts and blackouts. All right. So let's say we shut off the coal and so the black and the brown go, and you can see it gets to that at around 2032. Just in time for the Olympics in Brisbane. And we see the coal's out and we've got flexible gas, biomass, hydro, so all the blue and greeny stuff there. And then the pink one is coordinated storage. I assume that's batteries.
Well, there's a bit of a story behind that, but yeah, keep going.
Okay. And the big black bold line there is dispatchable capacity, which means this is the baseload power, the reliable power that we can turn on and off.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it baseload, but yeah, it's definitely more reliable than wind and solar. So this is stuff that you've got sitting there that can be turned on and off.
Okay.
Theoretically.
All right. And then above the big black line, you've got passive CER storage. I'm not going to ask what that is, something to do with batteries. Then you've got offshore wind in green, onshore wind in green, light green, and then you've got utility solar and rooftop solar. Okay.
And lots of it.
That's a hell of a lot of it. All right. And that goes up to about 300 by 2050 there. So assuming we need that, we are heavily reliant then on the sun.
Yeah, correct. And this is one of the risks. I mean, when Scott comes in and talks about the problems with small business and what's going on in the world, what are we going to power these businesses on? You can't go into a coffee shop and your barista goes, sorry, I'm waiting for the wind, where we don't have enough power right now.
Okay,
so that's a silly example, but you know, this is how silly the conversation's getting.
Yeah. All right, let's turn to the economics of it.
To me, Damien, and from a small business perspective or a user of electricity perspective, what's fundamentally relevant is that the demand for electricity is not going to decrease. I don't think anyone would dispute otherwise. It almost certainly will increase, and we need the capacity to meet that increase in demand. And so, you know, we do the best we can to model the different sources of power and the way we're going to increase that demand. And it's clear today that that projected increases, however they are not necessarily going to be met. And that's very problematic, you know, in my view, very problematic because energy, I think I've said this before, it says in the modern world, it is almost as fundamental as the air we breathe. Without energy, people do not survive, not in the population numbers that we have, at the moment. So
I don't think people realise, right, the importance of energy. It's not just your electricity, it's everything.
Yeah.
Right? Everything that's manufactured, everything that's produced is going to see an input cost increase. The price is going to go up. That's what causes inflation.
Well,
if we don't have cheap energy.
Again, it's a fundamental point. Energy is in everything, like absolutely everything around us. Anything anybody's ever made, anything anybody's ever produced has energy in it, and so the cost of energy is relevant. So there's a lot of points to talk about in this current debate. Fundamentally, you can't get away from, do we have capacity? And is it affordable? And so, in terms of capacity, there's multiple ways, obviously, for generating energy. But when you put all your eggs in one basket, which we seem to be going toward, renewable and nothing else, that creates a lot more risk. And again, Ben, you're the energy expert, but when I listen to the concepts of baseload, as I believe I understand a little bit, I think most people don't understand the fundamental importance of baseload in a national energy grid. Now, I don't know if you want to talk about that, but to me, that it's fundamentally relevant. And from my observations are that there is no solution for baseload without fossil fuel or nuclear in the mix at the moment. Renewables do not provide the baseload that this country needs.
Yeah, Scott. So different countries do it in different ways, and they use the resources they have available to them. So countries in Northern Europe and even Canada, they can consider hydro baseload because they have the snow melt. It's continuous. It's available all the time. Here in Australia, we have coal and gas. We could literally run our country off gas if we had the policies and the systems to run it that way. Although we export most of it, that's a whole different episode. But we don't have the hydro resources to do it. We do get quite a lot of rain. It's true that Australia's a dry country, but we do have significant rainfall in some areas, but not enough to build dams to run the country. Every time you try and build a dam, someone puts a hand up and says, no thanks, I don't like it.
Yep.
And this is one of the problems that we're going to find with the renewables rollout. So our natural resources, some would say, are sun and wind and land. And you go, okay, that's fine. But when you try and say, well, the sun's always shining somewhere or the wind's always blowing somewhere, the argument falls over very, very quickly. So, for example, one of the arguments is the wind is always blowing somewhere, so just build more wind turbines. But I would say to that person, well, please consider just two states, Queensland and New South Wales. If you're going to build the wind, if your strategy is the wind's always blowing somewhere, are you going to build the wind turbines in Queensland to supply New South Wales and vice versa? And you're also going to build the wind turbines in Queensland to supply Queensland and then move that electricity? Well, it doesn't make any sense at all.
Well, again, to me, I think having a mix of sources is important because essentially you hedge your bets that way. You should never put all your eggs in one basket. And we know we've got abundant fossil fuel resources in this country. We've been working on renewable sources for at least 2 decades, at least, as far as, in a concerted way.
Well, they've had a lot of help. They've had a lot of subsidy. They've had a lot of hot propping up politically.
And they still are subsidised, Damien.
And they still are massively subsidised. And you've got to ask yourself, why this hyper reaction to nuclear? Why are we getting this response of like, no nuclear? It's like, hang on, this is a bit fishy,
Is it about emissions reduction? Is it about energy security? Or is it just about ideology and people's preferred outcome?
Or is it about business and the fact that people have invested in, and I get this, people have invested in renewables, they want to see the return on their investment. They've got to, right? Otherwise you won't attract investment. Mm-hmm. But I don't think you can say, and it looks like the demand will be there for everything, so I don't think they've got to worry about that. By adding nuclear to the mix, we're not really eating into the capacity for renewables to actually sell their product. Are we?
Well, I'm going to say by adding nuclear into the mix, we actually get to observe firsthand how it competes with all other sources. So certainly when we have a market, and I call it a distorted market, when it's heavily subsidised. So it's very hard to, if we're coming down to cost of supply, it's very hard to accurately determine a cost of supply when renewables are so heavily subsidised.
And this is where everyone's getting so confused, because the numbers that are being thrown around, when they talk about renewables, they're talking about the subsidised cost, right? And then, you get into nuclear and they talk about just the bare cost. Let's have a listen to what Chris Bowen said on the 7:30 report this week when he was actually asked about costings.
The question asked by Peter Dutton in Question Time today and not answered by the Prime Minister was, what is the total cost of the government's energy plan? Is there a straight answer to that question?
$121 billion is the cost of non-customer-owned generation, transmission and storage, as is outlined in great detail in the last version of the Integrated Systems Plan. That'll be updated later this week, but that's the figure.
So why didn't the Prime Minister answer the question when asked this today?
Well, because the Prime Minister was pointing out that Mr Dutton's got to hide, asking about that when he announced a major shift in Australia's energy mix with absolutely no costings, no details, no respect shown to the Australian people in relation to their right for details. Now, they have been unable to answer basic questions about how many gigawatts nuclear power will generate at what expense. Now, experts have said $600 billion to generate nuclear power, which would be about the equivalent of 3% of our total generation mix. $600 billion for 3%? I mean, what a terrible equation.
Okay, look, I want to vomit, really, because I just find it so offensive that something as fundamentally important as our energy security as a nation, and our military security, which is tied up with energy, is being played with like this in games of political PR BS. It drives me nuts. He knows that those numbers he's giving are spin and distortion. So 121 billion for renewables, 600 billion for nuclear. And he stands there with us. Sorry.
Well, they certainly.
But anyway, let's pull it apart. So go ahead.
They certainly, appear misrepresented the numbers, and they're not the sort of numbers that we would rely on to develop a business case, say, for different mixes of energy in the country. What we would do, the sensible thing to do would because nuclear is not new to the world. As I understand it, there are, as we sit here now, 32 or 33 different countries with over 440 nuclear reactors.
33 countries, 440 nuclear reactors.
Generating power right now. So, China, as we know, has for a long time now been significantly increasing power throughout their country.
The UK they added 80 or something. The UK had plans to add 8, I know that. I don't know how they've gone with that last time we spoke.
Well, right now, China is building in construction a further 23 nuclear reactors while we sit here.
23.
23,
okay.
right now.
Right now. Okay, well that's good for our energy security and our military security. Why would we need to build any? Why would we need to have any? Honest to God. So Ben, just coming back to those numbers, just that 121 billion number, he put a lot of qualifiers around that. Just quickly unpack that for us.
So the 121 billion is supposed to be a net present value of future spending on transmission and wind and solar and batteries.
So that's the estimate now, what it would cost to spend this money in the future. Okay,
that's what they're saying. But they do leave out a few things. So when you get into the fine print in the reports, and there was a new report released this week by AMO, the Integrated System Plan, and this is where the numbers come from. They leave out things like committed and anticipated and future projects, things that aren't actually locked into the regulatory path yet. So anything that's locked in, they'll include the cost of that, but things that aren't yet approved, but they are expected to be approved, they sort of leave that out. Now, one of the other things he said, which is interesting, which he hasn't actually said before, is he said the 121 billion a couple of times in the past, including on David Spears back in March, but he said something about consumer owned at the start, which is a really interesting qualifier because
not consumer owned, you said, right?
Well,
non-consumer owned.
That's right, non-consumer owned. So in the chart that you had before, there was
let's put it back up. There was a capacity chart. Yeah.
There's a big purple section, and they call it consumer energy resources, coordinated consumer energy resources. Now, what that is home batteries, electric vehicles, and solar panels on people's roofs. Now, if you take the government's estimate of how many gigawatt hours, which is on a separate chart, of capacity in those home batteries, there's something like 150 gigawatt hours, which is more than the combined sum of all the pumped hydro in the country if you leave out Snowy 2, which is a really interesting number, right? That's a big number. So when you look at the cost of batteries now, and they're around about the $1,400, $1,500 per kilowatt hour, you do the maths on that and you add a few zeros and you get to over 200 billion. And now that's a cost that the 121 billion leaves out because they say, well, we're not spending it. Right. But to make the plan work, all the people have to spend it.
Yeah, it's completely disingenuous. The question is, what's the economic cost, the total economic cost of the thing?
And they don't want to say.
No, but they'll say it about nuclear. They'll inflate that number as much as
they come up with 600 billion, but this is...
Is that a fair number?
Look, it could be in a worst case scenario, but it's, they're talking about first of a kind blowouts, Snowy 2s all over again, every single time.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully we'd learn from that, right? And we're not even doing first of a kind if we're doing large modular, because first of a kind was done 30 years ago.
Anyway, the libertarian in me wants to say, just let the market work it out.
There's no market anymore,
Let the investors take the risk. Sorry, just a sec. Go ahead, you first.
Realistically, forget the numbers for a minute. Realistically, all you need to know is nuclear power is generated and used all over the world.
And it's safe.
It wouldn't be used all over the world if it were prohibitively expensive.
Right.
It just wouldn't be.
Right.
That's all you need to know.
Okay.
So then...
And if it is prohibitively expensive, people won't do it, and you don't need the ban.
Now, if you want a perfect example, of use nuclear don't use nuclear, I would go to Germany and the recent experiences in Germany. It's a global model for the world to look at. They literally turned off their nuclear power supply for ideological reasons, and now they're in a position right now where they don't have sufficient supply for their country without importing power. They burn lignite coal, which is the dirtiest of all coal. Therefore, their environmental position has worsened. And as a result of turning off that power, their energy costs throughout the country have tripled.
And their military national security is in Russia's hands because Russia has the tap for the gas, as Donald Trump pointed out to them.
If a country doesn't have energy, they're not militarily secure.
No.
It's as simple as that.
They're not economically secure either.
So Germany has to rely on other countries for their own national security.
Yeah.
So, forget the numbers for a minute. Just if it were not cost effective, and you don't even have to for a minute consider what's more cost effective in terms of an energy supply, what's less, all you need to know is it's done everywhere. It's done everywhere.
That's right.
Germany turned it off, and their position went south at a rate of knots.
And we need the power, and we can afford to have it all in the mix if people are willing to invest in it. So let's just get out of their way and make it easy. Any final comments from you, Ben?
The market side of it, I think, is going to be a struggle. I kind of agree with the coalition's plan to build it themselves. Whether there could be some private investment at some point down the future, yeah, absolutely. But I think the market situation is so hideously distorted and broken that I don't think you're going to get a private investor building any baseload power stations in this country ever again.
All right. Well, let's continue this conversation on those lines next time. We'll get you guys back because it's been a crazy news week this week and we're out of time already at 20 minutes, so we don't have time to go into it anymore. But I would love to talk more deeply about the best ways to looking at the energy market in more detail and what is wrong with the way that we're running the system at the moment and whether a free market is going to be better than a government centralised controlled one in this case. And it may be that horribly it might not be. So we'll talk about that another time. But guys, thanks very much for coming in. Ben Beattie, Baseload Podcast is the place to go. Baseload, Baseload.
That's it. Thank you, Damien.
And Scott, you are not published other than here on the other side, but it's always great to have you on.
It is.
So Scott Pelto is our economics commentator and Ben Beattie, our energy commentator here on the other side. And that is all we have time for this week on The Other Side, your weekly summary of the best news and commentary without the woke. Just a reminder, we are taking a little winter holiday break for the first 2 weeks of July. Our next show will be Friday, July 19. So no show next week or the week after, but we will be dropping those holiday clips every night at 7:30, so you won't miss us too much. Please tell your friends about the show. We really do need your support to keep on keeping on. And I look forward to seeing you again after our little holiday break. See you on July 19, and please enjoy the clips in the meantime. Take care. Bye for now.